Imagine waking up in a world where your very survival depends not on a paycheck or passport, but on the land beneath your feet, and who you owe loyalty to for standing on it. This wasn't just medieval Europe's political reality, it was its military engine. Before professional armies, before national strategy, before generals with satellite maps, there was a patchwork of men, each bound by blood, fear, and sworn oaths to fight when called. This was feudalism. It wasn't a unified state. It was a network of personal obligations, where power flowed from the top down and loyalty flowed back up, often with a sword in hand. And this system didn't just shape society. It shaped how wars were fought, who got to fight them, and how long they could last. In this video, we'll uncover how this decentralized hierarchy created some of the most iconic and chaotic forms of warfare the world has ever seen. Because in the Middle Ages, war wasn't just politics by other means. It was land management, reputation, and survival, all happening at the edge of a blade. To understand medieval warfare, you first have to understand feudalism. And it all starts with a single question: who owns the land? In the feudal world, land was power, but no king could manage it all alone. Instead, land was granted to nobles, lords who swore loyalty in return for authority over their slice of the kingdom. These lords had vassals, often knights, who held smaller parcels and owed them military service. Beneath them were peasants and serfs, who worked the land and, in times of war, sometimes picked up weapons themselves. This created a living web of obligation, a pyramid of promises. When a king needed to go to war, he didn't summon a national army. He sent messengers to his barons and dukes. In return, those lords summoned their own knights, footmen, and retainers. This was the feudal levy, an army not raised from citizens, but from personal loyalty. A military force made of landowners and their clients, who fought not for ideology, but for duty, debt, and often survival. And it wasn't just about showing up. A knight's entire status depended on fulfilling these duties, appearing in full armor, with their horse, weapons, and sometimes even bringing their own men-at-arms. The richer the lord, the more well-equipped and numerous his fighting force. But here's the twist. There was no central command. Each group arrived under their own banner, loyal to their own lord, with their own agenda. This was no standing army. It was a political patchwork-turned military machine, and it worked, but only when held together by shared interests and well-timed fear. The battlefield, in a sense, mirrored the society that created it: fractured, hierarchical, and deeply personal. Now picture this. One moment you're a peasant tilling soil, harvesting barley beneath a low sun, and the next, you're handed a spear and told to march alongside armored knights into battle. That was the brutal reality of the feudal levy. Feudal warfare didn't rely on a standing army. Instead, it depended on an agricultural population being pulled directly from the land, transformed, sometimes overnight, into makeshift soldiers. Lords didn't keep year-round troops on payroll. Why would they? War was seasonal. It was expensive. So when it came, they called in their dues and their men. The moment a king declared war, a ripple effect followed. Lords summoned their vassals, knights gathered their gear, and peasants, well, they were expected to show up, often with whatever tools they could afford to turn into weapons. A pitchfork might have been just that the day before. But now, it was a lance. But this system came with a host of problems. First, the levy service was time-limited. In many regions, men were obligated to fight for just 40 days. That's not much time to march, fight, siege, and return. If the conflict dragged on, many simply left. They weren't deserters by law. They had fulfilled their obligation. Second, there was no uniform training. A knight might be well drilled from youth, trained in swordplay, mounted combat, and chivalric ideals. But the average levy? They might have never seen a battlefield. Coordination between nobles' forces was difficult, if not impossible, especially when soldiers were of mixed skill levels and backgrounds. Third, equipment varied wildly. Wealthier vassals might bring chainmail and war horses. Poorer ones? A padded tunic and a wooden shield. It made for uneven ranks and uneven outcomes. And yet, this was how kingdoms defended themselves, how conquests were launched. The feudal levy was not professional, but it was adaptable and deeply rooted in local power structures. A farmer might know little of war, but he knew whose banner he fought under, and that loyalty could be fierce. In time, this decentralized, unstable model would give way to more organized national armies. But for centuries, this was the norm, a force born not in barracks, but in barns. If feudal warfare had a face, it was armored, mounted, and carried a lance. The medieval knight wasn't just a soldier, he was a social institution. Trained from boyhood, bound by a code of honor, and equipped at great cost, the knight symbolized the aristocracy's grip on war. His existence was made possible entirely by the feudal system, and in many ways the battlefield was designed for him. Only landowning lords could afford the full package: warhorse, chainmail, and later plate armor, weapons, and the cost of squires and training. In return for their land, these knights owed military service to their overlord. That meant when the call came, they rode, literally, into duty. But this dominance wasn't just about flashy gear or noble status. It was about raw tactical power. A knight's charge, hundreds of armored horses barreling down a hillside with lances lowered, was devastating. It could shatter poorly formed lines, scatter levied peasants, and overwhelm lightly armored opponents. For a time, it was the apex of medieval warfare, and kings who could field more cavalry almost always had the upper hand. But knights didn't just defend the kingdom on the battlefield, they protected its core from within, through a second great innovation of feudal warfare, the castle. Feudalism's obsession with land made defense a local affair, and castles were its answer. These weren't just homes for nobility, they were military hubs, control centers, and fortresses all in one. Stone towers loomed over villages, not only to watch for invaders, but to remind everyone who ruled the land. Each castle was a mini-kingdom, self-sustaining, defensible, and symbolically powerful. With moats, drawbridges, arrow slits, and reinforced gates, they turned warfare into a waiting game. Sieges replaced open battles. Castles could withstand weeks or months of assault, forcing attackers to bring siege towers, trebuchets, or suffer starvation. And here's the irony. While knights and castles were built to protect and display feudal power, they also exposed its weaknesses. A powerful lord in a well-defended castle could resist even a king, and many did. Together, knights and castles defined the military identity of feudal Europe. One was the mobile fist, the other, the immovable wall. And both were shaped entirely by a world where land, loyalty, and war were inseparable. Feudal armies looked impressive on the surface. Noble banners fluttering in the wind, shining knights, and foot soldiers gathered from across a lord's territory. But beneath the armor and oaths lay a truth that shaped, and often crippled, medieval warfare. Loyalty had a price, and it wasn't always paid in gold, because feudal loyalty was personal, not professional. A vassal served a lord, not a kingdom, and that meant war campaigns were plagued with hidden risks, not from the enemy, but from within their own ranks. Let's break this down. The moment a king summoned his lords to battle, each lord had to decide, do I answer the call? Most did, for honor, obligation, or out of fear. But some didn't, and others answered half-heartedly, sending the bare minimum of troops. After all, there were no contracts, no standing pay, and no guarantee of success. Even once on the battlefield, unity was fragile. Each lord had his own goals, protecting land, gaining spoils, advancing status. Coordinated military strategy? Rare. Some lords argued over precedence, refusing to take orders from rivals of equal rank. Others withdrew mid-campaign, especially once their 40-day feudal service expired. And let's not forget ambition. More than one noble saw war as an opportunity to expand their own power, not just serve the king. Some even switched sides if it meant a better deal. Treachery wasn't common, but it was always a possibility. These fractures meant that most feudal campaigns were short, local, and reactive. Grand conquests were difficult to plan and harder to sustain. A king couldn't count on long-term loyalty without paying mercenaries or negotiating every step of the way. That's why we often see castles and fortified towns playing such a central role. Because even when a campaign fell apart, even when alliances shifted or knights deserted, the castle stood. It could hold off attackers even if the rest of the army collapsed. The feudal world's military strength wasn't in its organization. It was in its ability to withstand collapse. Ironically, the very personal nature of feudal loyalty, which once seemed like its strength, became its greatest strategic liability. Kings learned quickly that oaths alone don't win wars, and over time that lesson would reshape warfare across Europe. So, if the feudal system was so fragmented, so inefficient, and often so unreliable in war, Why did it last for centuries? Because it wasn't built for conquest. It was built for control. Feudal warfare wasn't about lightning strikes or decisive battles. It was about holding territory, managing people, and projecting power across a fractured landscape. Castles weren't just strongholds. They were symbols of order in a world without central authority. Knights weren't just warriors. They were enforcers of law, managers of land, and keepers of peace when they weren't starting wars of their own. But as kingdoms grew and ambition outpaced tradition, the cracks in the system widened. By the late Middle Ages, kings wanted more than loyalty. They wanted control. They needed trained armies, predictable results, and the ability to wage long campaigns. That meant mercenaries, standing troops, and professional officers. It meant tax-funded war machines instead of unpaid feudal levies. And it meant centralizing power, not scattering it across 100 castles. But make no mistake, the feudal legacy didn't vanish. The ideals of chivalry, heraldry, and noble command continued to echo through military traditions. Even the uniforms, formations, and banners of later national armies carried the DNA of the feudal age. And many of the fortifications built under feudal rule stood for centuries after the system that created them had faded. In short, feudalism didn't just shape warfare. It left a shadow that lingered long after its age had passed. When we look back at medieval warfare, it's tempting to see only the chaos, the mismatched armor, the ragtag levies, the scattered strategies. But behind the dust and the noise was a system, a deeply human system built on loyalty, fear, ambition, and land. Feudalism didn't just give us castles and knights. It gave us a world where politics was military and military was local, where your best hope of survival wasn't a national army, but the stone walls of your nearest castle, where every campaign was shaped not just by terrain and tactics, but by personal oaths and the fragile egos of nobles. Yes, feudal warfare was flawed, disorganized, unpredictable, but it was also ingenious, tailored perfectly to a fractured world where kings ruled more in theory than in practice. And for centuries, it worked. Eventually, it would be replaced by something stronger, more centralized, more professional. But what it left behind, in the structure of armies, in the strategy of defense, and in the legacy of military honor. If this breakdown of feudal warfare surprised you, hit that like button and subscribe for more forgotten history revealed. What part of medieval war strategy shocked you the most? The fragile loyalties, the castle-centered defense, or the role of knights as both warriors and landlords? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear your take. And don't forget, the past still shapes the present, especially when it comes to power.